Hello, and welcome to the Hadal Quadrants. I'm your host, Leslee Petersen, and I invite you to join us on our dive to the bottom of the political compass and explore the ideas of anarchy from various perspectives. There are no gods, no masters, no captains in the Hadal Quadrants.
Hello and welcome to the Hadal Quadrants. My name is Leslee Petersen and I am here today with Ashley Shade and Logan Marie Glitterbomb. Would you care to introduce yourselves?
I'm Logan Marie Glitterbomb. I work for Center for a Stateless Society. I am a writer and fellow and host of the Green Market Agorist podcast. Pronoun she, her.
Wonderful. Thank you for joining us today. And Ashley?
Yes, hello, my name is Ashley Shade. I am the chair of Outright Libertarians, a nonprofit organization dedicated to fighting for the LGBTQ community. I am the chair of the Libertarian Party of Massachusetts, and I am a candidate for North Adams City Council, and I am a transgender woman and activist.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So today's episode, we're going to be discussing trans history and the latest rash of anti-trans bills all across the country. In particular, some ones from Alabama and ones in my state here in New Hampshire that have been brought up. I'm sure they're everywhere at this point, though. Very unfortunate. I just wanted to start, for our audience who may not be quite as aware of the LGBTQ community, what does being trans mean?
Honestly, I am trans and I couldn't even tell you. That's one of those questions that the more you think about it, the more complex it gets sometimes. But it's just people who do not identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth, to put it simply.
Yeah, that is the Wikipedia definition.
How that gets expressed and how that interacts with each of our experiences and lives is so extremely different. I don't even know how to describe it outside of that.
Yeah. Ashley, do you have any input?
Yeah, absolutely. Being transgender is a different experience for every individual. It comes with different everything. It's different based on where you live, it's different based on your family, it's different based on the people in your life, and it's different based on your healthcare providers. The experience can be extremely different from one person to another, even in the same community. So being trans to me I look at it as transgender is a descriptive word. It describes my experience as a woman. And so I am a transgender woman, and transgender helps describe my experience in being a woman and being who I am. So that's how I look at the word transgender. It's a descriptive word, and it doesn't mean that somebody who is transgender is less than the gender they are telling you that they are, if they tell you they don't have a gender.
Yeah, that's a great explanation. It definitely brings in some of the variety of identities that fall under. It could be called a trans umbrella. We have binary trans identities, non-binary trans identities, agender trans identities.
Yeah, absolutely. The trans umbrella is very wide, and essentially what it comes down to is that you are non-conforming to what society would traditionally define as male or female. You don't conform or don't believe in society's set definition, but you might fall under the trans umbrella.
Yeah, I'm sure more people could fall under it if there was a more welcoming aspect of society around gender exploration.
Yeah, I completely agree.
But we have been seeing an increase in gender identity exploration and expression over the last 2 decades or so. It's been growing.
Yeah, as society's becoming more accepting, at least culturally in some ways. You're seeing a lot more people come out, and then of course the detractors see a lot more people coming out and claim it's some new thing or there's a new rise in it. And how do we explain the rise in it? We explain it by people allowed to be able to express that. Like, It's not as difficult to understand as people make it out to be in that sense, but people just similar to any time conservatives see a rise in any sort of expression or, in some cases with certain medical diagnoses, they try to find some conspiratorial bend behind why it exists rather and act like it's new instead of so it's the water turned us gay and trans or whatever. That and soy, I think. I don't know. I eat a lot of soy. I guess that's what it had to do with it.
That had something to do with it at some point. So I think this is a perfect segue into talking about trans history, and maybe we can keep it just to the U.S. queer liberation movement, because that is a whole topic. Could fill up hours of that.
Absolutely. When you think about it, the history of being trans actually goes back to native tribes, where they had what they called two-spirited people. And people who were two-spirited were actually considered the village elders. They were considered the wisest people because they experienced the gender from the spectrum, because they were better able to relate to all of the people in their villages. And that's something that's really important to remember. It's an experience that has transcended human history. It's not new. It's just no longer hidden. Yeah. And that's the big part of it. Just like homosexuality, being trans has always been persecuted against, especially in European-type colonizations, and being different in any way has always been an issue. Conformity has always been the key to many civilizations throughout history. But if you look at Native American history, they celebrated people who were different. They celebrated the idea of gender being a spectrum and people being able to experience both genders or experience whatever gender that they identified with. Identity is very important to the human connection to the world. And so how we identify helps explain how we experience the world. And so in U.S. history, this brings us to, there have been trans people out there for hundreds and hundreds of years, thousands of years. It got really popular in the 1900s, really is where you started first hearing about it in history books or famous people who might have been trans. There were several musicians who were famous. And then it really came out with the Stonewall riots. There were trans people leading the Stonewall riots in the fight against oppression and the fight against government interfering in people's lives and brutalizing them and oppressing them. And Pride started out as a riot. It wasn't a celebration. It was a fight just to exist and be seen and heard in public. And that's something to remember. Trans people were also a part of that fight and led that fight.
I think it's important to talk about what happened at Stonewall. So what happened was you had a queer community that congregated in a mafia-run bar that was frequently targeted by police. And the patrons of this bar were frequently arrested under charges of sodomy or perversion, anything that they could get them on. So what we ended up happening is the customers of the bar ended up revolting one day against being targeted so frequently by the police. And that turned into the first Pride. The riot became the Pride.
Even before that, though, we have to remember that there was a rich history of gay and trans rights. Where I grew up in Louisiana, the tribe of Yuga was the first gay Mardi Gras crew. And this was pre-Stonewall. You were not allowed to congregate in groups as queer folks. You were not allowed to cross-dress in public. Those rules were not really enforced during Mardi Gras. People cross-dressed as part of just the Mardi Gras celebration in general. It was part of costuming. Straight cis-het people did it all the time as part of, and still do. And so that was allowed. Many of the men in the tribe of Yuga talk about how, growing up, their moms made them like Mardi Gras gowns and stuff to wear when they were young children and things like that, and how that was one of their favorite times of year. And everybody's congregated out there and partying, so they can't tell who's queer and who's not in that same way. Like, they got away with it under the general, just the celebration that was Mardi Gras. And the tribe of Yuga was a big, huge step in that, and that they weren't explicitly, outwardly gay to the public, from my understanding in the beginning at all, but it was more or less they used the cover of a Mardi Gras crew to congregate and to get together and to be able to hold meetings and discuss things, not just to deal with Mardi Gras, but to deal with the queer liberation movement at the time. And they really used that to challenge a lot of that area's prejudice and legislation. And I don't know, like, it's interesting. Like, Stonewall's credited as the tipping point.
Yeah.
But we have to remember all that came before that, too. And with trans rights, really, that came to prominence in the public eye with Christine Jorgensen having the first major publicized surgery. She ended up like making huge news, and I know there's that Ed Wood movie Glenn or Glenda, which originally was loosely based on Christine Jorgensen's story and then quickly became about his own cross-dressing. That was an interesting point in history, but yeah, it's still going on today. There was that brief period in where the gay rights movement was so hyper focused on marriage that it seemed that it was to the exclusion of trans issues, and there was the whole we'll come back for you
Yeah.
line, like, continuously. And thank God some of those groups, actually, people held their feet to the fire and they did come back for us. They were forced to by amazing activists who kept them true to their word. Now we're seeing our modern queer liberation movement really taking off. But post Stonewall, we had groups like the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, which was started by Sylvia Rivera, and they had the Star House, which acted as a shelter for homeless queer youth. You have, similar to that, you just have the entirety of the ball scene.
Mm-hmm. I was gonna bring that up.
Very much acted as a refuge for a lot of queer youth, predominantly queer people of color. It was very much predominantly a Black cultural thing, and is such an integral part of a lot of the early AIDS movement and stuff. Very much, especially in New York, was centered around the ball scene, or had a lot of involvement from the ball scene, I should say. And just, yeah, we can go on for hours, but with ACT UP and all, like, a lot of the AIDS movement and a lot of just, there's so much history there, and that's just, like you said, covering the U.S.
If anybody wants to know more about the ball scene, there is a great show out, I forget which network is carrying it, called Pose. Highly recommend. It's been a very enjoyable watch.
Yeah.
But can one of you talk a little bit more about what queer liberation means?
It's exactly what it says it is. Queer is like an umbrella term for the entire community. And liberation is about fighting for our rights to be who we are, to be able to exist in this world without persecution, without having to be afraid, without having to hide. Liberation is about freedom, and all people should have the right to live their lives how they choose, as long as they're not hurting others. And queer liberation is a fight, it's a celebration, it's a community, it's an action, it's so many things. But at its core, it is a fight for our right to exist in this world and exist publicly. in this world and exist without restrictions on who we are and who we love.
No, that's a great definition of that there.
I was going to say that queer liberation is the fight for queer rights, and queer rights are human rights. It's the right for adequate housing. It's the right to love who we want to love, to dress how we want to dress, to be able to just use the bathroom, to be able to have food security, have health care, and all the things that everybody needs and everybody wants.
Yeah.
And in the end, trans rights are just human rights.
Yeah. No, I mean, that simple little sentence right there, trans rights are human rights, is a great descriptor of queer liberation, with queer rights are human rights to be the corollary to that for the larger community. I hate to put a downer on this, but can we talk about some of the ways the state and government have inhibited queer rights, and in particular trans rights, throughout the years, so that we can talk about the bills that are currently in session?
We touched on it when we talked about Stonewall. For years, it was illegal to be gay. It was illegal to be queer. People would arrest queer people on indecency charges, on nudity, on obscenity, on sodomy, on different ways of just regulating morality. And for years, being queer, being trans, being gay was defined as a mental disorder. You were thought to be crazy. You were thought to have something wrong with your mind. And luckily, we've come to a point in human history where that's starting to be redefined, and it's being redefined as no longer being a mental illness, because it's not. Being who you are is not a mental illness. Loving people is not a mental illness. Quite frankly, we could use a hell of a lot more love in this world than we could with all the hate that we have. But throughout history, the transgender community especially has been persecuted. They've had to hide, and our community is facing one of the most brutal legislative agendas in the history of the United States this year. More than 117 pieces of legislation have been introduced in over 33 states in the United States. And these pieces of legislation are there they exist just so one group of people can rile up their base and say, look, we're trying to protect you, when they're really just trying to hurt others and using it as an excuse to raise money for their political campaigns. Because that's what it really comes down to. There's a lot of people with hate who have money. And so let's get them fired up and excited. Let's get their money. And they're doing it the way they've always been doing it, by attacking a marginalized community.
Mm-hmm.
That's how politicians have raised money and support for centuries. Attack the smaller groups who are different, point them out as being not belonging, and make any excuse you can to demonize and dehumanize them.
So it seems to me, paying attention to the news, that there are two major themes in anti-trans bills right now. One of them is denying healthcare, particularly healthcare to youth, under the guise of teenagers can't make decisions about their own bodies. And then the other one, for some reason, is about sports. I fail to understand why this is so important that it needs legislation. But this is a common bill that I keep seeing. I know New Hampshire, where I live, had a bill in session. It got stuck in committee, thank goodness, but prohibiting trans youth from going and joining the teams of their preferred gender.
These bills all have one thing in common. And I would actually throw a third one out there, because bathroom bills are starting to become a thing again, too.
Oh, no. I moved away from North Carolina because my life partner is trans because of the bathroom bill. And the fact that the KKK was marching through the small town we lived in. But mostly because I couldn't go out in public with him and have him use the restroom anywhere. It was... I moved 1,000 miles away.
Exactly. And what's happening here? These bills have one thing in common. What they have in common is that people who don't actually understand what transgender is or means are making legislation under the so-called disguise of safety. That's their claim. It keeps people safe. But let's break it down a little bit. When it comes to bathroom bills, what they're saying is two things. One, that women are inferior to men and need to be protected. And two, that they think men are such predators that they would claim to be transgender to be predators. That's what they're really saying.
Yeah.
So what they're saying is they're so afraid of the behavior in our society that's acceptable of men that they don't want people who transition in bathrooms with women because they're afraid they're gonna hurt them. That to me is
That's
a problem on the yeah, exactly. So what does that tell us? What it tells us is that our society needs to change our culture around how men behave towards women. That's what it's really about. So stop blaming us. We just gotta pee. There's already laws out there. If we were gonna hurt someone, we would get arrested for it. We would already face criminal prosecution. And to those on the right who want to make this argument, we have to protect people, every time there's a shooting out there, what's the first thing you say? Don't punish people who haven't done a crime. We haven't done anything wrong. Why should we have to face more restrictions?
Mm-hmm.
It's the same thing for trans people. We're not attacking people. We haven't hurt anyone. We just gotta pee. And quite frankly, nobody wants to be in the goddamn public bathroom in the first place. They're disgusting. They're cesspools. So geez, let us use the bathroom and leave us the fuck alone.
And it's encouraging.
Right? I'm thankful that I live in an area that one of the few, actually the only area in my state that has laws that just let me go to the fucking bathroom.
It shouldn't be something that you have to praise for your area.
Yeah, and I'm lucky in that I can use the bathroom. Like I have a gym membership, and I'm gonna scare all the transphobes in there. I use the women's locker room. Oh, yeah. Nobody cares. I don't even know if anybody knows or notices.
People just want to change.
Thankfully for me, I have that privilege. Not everyone does, but that's the other thing is people don't realize that they've been dealing with passing trans people in their bathrooms and their locker rooms for forever.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
They're just mad because now non-passing people are afforded the same rights.
Yeah, exactly. And if you've ever been into a women's restroom, there are individual stalls in there. You're not sharing the same stall with your pants down as anybody else. It's just absurd. And even before we had public restrooms, we used to have public outhouses, and those weren't gendered. Everybody went to use the outhouse. You did your business, and you walked away. Like, the bathroom is that. It's a place to eliminate waste. And the waste we need to start eliminating, unfortunately, is in the legislature. Yeah. And then we turn the focus on children. We have to protect the children. Let's clarify some really important points here. Number one, informed consent for healthcare doesn't exist for children. Can't just decide I'm going to have surgery, walk in, tell a doctor they're trans, and get a gender-confirming surgery the next day. That doesn't happen. It doesn't even happen for adults. The waiting lists for surgery are years. It is so difficult. And there is a standard of healthcare for trans people.
As far as my understanding, no state in the U.S. offers surgery to anyone under 18.
Yeah, so...
There are extenuating circumstances for people of, I think, about 16, but definitely not under 16 for sure.
So
if somebody's emancipated at 16, they might be able to, but
Makes
it's
sense.
the exception,
so
not the rule.
They're emancipated. They get a whole bunch of rights that,
Exactly.
And at that point, they are considered fit enough to make decisions in the rest of their life. They should be able to make decisions in their healthcare. So,
Exactly.
So it does need to be.
yeah, the only thing we allow to children is at most puberty blockers and maybe hormones. And even hormones is usually not given to, especially not younger kids. That's only given to like teenagers. Once you get up in teenage years, usually.
Yeah, the standard is
'cause
after
that makes
18.
sense. Because why would you give anyone hormones that has? They act like they're giving them to 3-year-olds. They're not going to give anyone hormones that hasn't gone through puberty in the first place. They start with puberty blockers. Like the scare tactics that conservatives use are just. It doesn't make any sense. It's not based in reality or science. And if it were based in science, then they'd actually be on our side, because not that our identities have to be backed up by science to be valid, but there is a lot of scientific evidence proving that gender is a lot more complex than we used to define it.
Yeah.
I mean,
Absolutely.
there's there's like 5 different characteristics that make up gender, and there's like very few. Most people, even who identify as cisgender, don't have all 5 of those categories lining up perfectly in one way or the other to fit perfectly male or female.
So
As scientifically defined, and even that's bullshit to some degree, in how we culturally define gender versus scientific sex.
Absolutely. But even with that, let's get back to the core issue of the laws preventing children from their health care. What you're doing is you're saying that medical professionals who have trained, who have been licensed, who know and study this information, you're saying that their judgment is terrible because they treat certain groups of people. You're saying that their expertise doesn't matter. And let's face it, again, there's something called WPATH, which helps, essentially is the guide for transgender healthcare throughout the world. Children do not get hormones before puberty. Blockers in most patients is reversible up to a certain period of time. And hormones are never prescribed to people who haven't, as you said, started puberty. So nobody under the age of 10 or 11 is going to be on hormones. And even right away, they're not going to be on hormones. They're going to be on puberty blockers. And those blockers give you the time to have to be able to ensure that you've had the proper experience, so that this is the path that you truly, that medically makes the most sense for a patient. And these decisions aren't made alone. There's general practice doctors, there's endocrinologists involved, and then there's mental health professionals. And there's a required period of time of mental health professionals that you have to see in order to even begin hormone blockers as a child. Never mind even getting to the point of actual hormones. So it's such a complex situation. And we have this group of people in the legislature who are completely ignoring the medical advice of the scientific-backed knowledge and treatment advice of medical professionals. And that's really dangerous. It's dangerous to say to a doctor that you cannot treat your patient. Medical decisions should be left between a patient and the doctor. And in some cases, with minors, the parents should be involved in the discussion. But at the end of the day, the minors and the doctor are the ones, the patient and the doctor are the ones who make those decisions. And that's how it's supposed to be. It's not the government's business. It's not the legislature's business. It's not the church's business. It's the patient's business and the doctor's business. That's what it comes down to. And let me tell you this right now. There is no insurance company in the world, or at least in the United States, who's going to sit there and say, oh, little Timmy went to the doctor at 6 years old, wants to be called Jane, and has been prescribed estrogen. No insurance is going to cover that. It's not going to happen. Our system doesn't just give you free medication like that. It's not cheap to transition. So let's be realistic. What this is about riling up a base using discriminatory tactics against a marginalized community to help strengthen their pocketbooks and help strengthen their voter base, who is, quite frankly, very uninformed. And I also want to point out really quickly, it's not just conservatives. I know plenty of people who consider themselves progressives who still think that children shouldn't be able to transition because they really don't understand the true science behind it. And they don't understand what it's like. And they don't understand that they're actually hurting children by preventing them from transitioning more than they're actually trying to help them.
So I think...
Oh, yeah. The amount of trans people... It's a common meme in the trans experience of having... being a teenager in your later life again, going through second puberty is... And there's something to be said about how trans people experience time differently because of that, and how we're robbed of just being able to have a normal childhood in most cases.
Yeah.
And you end up having to go through going through puberty in your 20s, 30s, or even later sucks. Going through puberty in general sucks. But, like, most cis people can't imagine, like, going through puberty twice and going through puberty so late in life and dealing with all those emotions, dealing with all that change, discovering yourself, and dealing with, like, your changing body and dealing with what comes with that of finding your fashion sense and all that shit and going through all the blunders. And there you are doing that in your 30s looking like you're a middle schooler, like trying to figure your way through it. When it's to a certain extent, like, as trans people, we make memes out of that and we find our small little joys in it in some ways, but I mean, it sucks. Like,
it sucks so much.
Yeah, and it makes it so much harder in a society that wants you to pass to even be taken seriously, when you have to learn all that a decade or more after all of your peers.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. And kids today that are allowed these treatments are so lucky. And it's so sad to see it stripped away in areas that it was gained. And they're not only taking these treatments away from these kids, they're threatening to arrest the doctors who defy those rules. And any doctor who chooses to defy the law and treat their patients adequately will be imprisoned in many of these areas. And I'm hoping we see a lot of civil disobedience in that area, but that's also a lot to ask for someone to risk a medical license, which they assumedly went into a bunch of debt for and spent years of their life to get.
12 years
and
of
lots
education.
of hard work.
Yeah.
That's a lot to ask doctors to do. I hope that if they're not able to engage in civil disobedience to that level, that they're at least involved to varying degrees with pushing back against that. And we are seeing a lot of doctors and other medical professionals coming out and in this fight and really hugely supporting it. So that's really good. And just a touch, he brought up earlier sports too, because that's the other big piece of legislation that is circling around various states and getting passed, is these various sports bans, these bans on trans youth in sports. I guess they're not banned from doing sports altogether, just banned from being on the team that actually matches their gender.
It ends up being a ban, though, because
exactly.
They're forced off of the team of the gender assigned at birth due to their queerness, and then they're banned from the team that they should be on. So it's an effective ban on trans youth playing sports at all in public schools.
Yeah. There are some people who will just bite the bullet and go on the other team or whatever, but effectively, most people will not. And the thing is, any of the concerns that are had are just, why the hell are we still gendering most sports anyways? That's the big question. It's an outdated thing. Like, we could talk about maybe needing to segregate sports based on weight class or skill level or things like that based on different sports, but to say that it needs to be based on gender is just
especially for youth sports.
Yeah, it goes back to the mindset that women are inferior to men. That women are physically...
The best football players on our high school football team was a woman.
Yeah, and here's the thing. When it comes to professional sports, there's a big difference in talent level and skills in many ways. I don't think many WNBA players could compete in the NBA. So I would agree with that.
There's some
but that doesn't mean they
controversy
shouldn't
there.
be allowed to. Yeah.
Is that due to lack of resources and funding and the ability to practice and all of
No, I honestly, in the NBA, the average height is 6'8" for men. It's 6'1" for women. That's a big disadvantage to overcome in many ways, but it doesn't mean that there aren't women in the NBA who could run circles around the men. Physically, I've seen women that are faster than men. I was an athlete before I transitioned. I played football for 10 years, 4 in high school and 6 years at the semi-pro level. I can tell you right now that I was invited after transitioning to play professional women's football with a women's team. And many of those women were better athletes and in much better shape than the men I played semi-professional football with.
Yeah.
Let me tell you that right now. They worked harder, they wanted it more, and they were real athletes. So let's make this really clear right now. If you want equality in sports, you separate people by height, weight, and hormone level. That's fairness. What about all these dudes who are doing roids in high school trying to make it to college teams? They're not testing that. They're not testing hormone levels. Hormone levels, testosterone specifically, is the hormone that really dictates how big your muscles are going to grow, how much of an advantage you have over other athletes. That's it. The Olympics has had trans athletes for decades, okay? They have no requirement for transgender men to compete as men. They do have a requirement for women. So if you are a trans woman and you identify as a woman, the requirement for the Olympics is 3 things. 1, you must declare your gender publicly and have not changed it for at least a year. 2, you have to have received hormone treatment for a minimum of 1 year and test under a certain testosterone level for a minimum of 1 year. And 3, if you publicly change your gender back, which doesn't happen, if you were to do that, you would be disqualified for 4 years. Those are the requirements.
That sounds pretty reasonable.
And in the Olympics, if transgender people were truly this fear of, oh, transgender people are just transitioning to be women because they were bad athletes as men and they just want to go win and win scholarships and win all these things. If that were truly happening, we would hear about transgender women winning Olympic gold every sport every time the Olympics come by. How many transgender women have you ever heard with a gold medal competing as a transgender woman?
I don't pay attention to sports, so
Can you name any?
I couldn't
Can we
name
name
any
any?
gold.
The only gold medalist I can name that's trans is Caitlyn Jenner. And she competed long before transitioning.
I always
So
forget
let's
about
be
her.
real. The advantage is, what really is the advantage is the hormones. So if you're doing this about fairness and safety, test people's hormones levels. Don't automatically disqualify them on the basis of what's in their pants. And don't try to introduce legislation to check what's in someone's pants so they can qualify for a team. Because that's starting to happen too. They want coaches to actually check what genitalia their athletes have to make sure that they are truly male or female in their perceived definitions.
I'm
And
sorry.
as we all know, anybody who knows anything about sports, there's been a lot of people who have gone to prison recently, a lot of allegations coming out about sexual abuse and sexual misconduct, especially on female athletes, for decades. So are you really trying to keep female athletes safe, or are you just trying to expose them to more predators? Which is what it really sounds like you're trying to do.
Yeah, for some reason I thought the conservatives were against child molestation, since pedophilia seems to be a big issue to them, but guess not.
Yeah, it's a big issue to them unless it happens at church. Then it's okay.
Or
As long as you can pray the sin away afterwards. Yeah, molesting our children is fine at church, but don't let that girl play on my team.
If you're a pro-life politician, you can get away with it, just as long as you vote pro-life.
that seems to have been
Leave
working
the
so
children
well
to
lately.
molest later. Or something. Wait.
You can't molest them if they're not alive, so you gotta keep them alive so they can be molested.
Ooh,
That's kind of the thought process amongst the religious people, I think. Who else are they got?
But also,
I'm cutting
if
this
they're
part out.
if they're satanic and they're also sacrificing them for their adrenochrome, then all of a sudden molesting children is no longer cool. Or if they're trans and they're trying to sneak into a bathroom to molest children, it's no longer cool.
You know, molestation is just disgusting. And what it comes down to, really, we can solve all of these problems with one thing. And that one thing is let people make their own decisions as long as they're not hurting others. Let people consent to their own medical treatment. Let people make their own decisions on what athletics they play. And let people make decisions on where they drop their excrement.
Yeah. And I mean,
As long as they're not hurting anyone else. You gotta go, you gotta go.
Yeah. And you touched on something briefly earlier when talking about trans athletes, and you were like, if you publicly declare your gender and then people don't publicly retract that later on, and but always you hear the detransitioners brought up as like a thing to anytime medical care is brought up, especially when talking about medical care for children. They always talk about the rate of detransition and blah, blah, blah. And just to address that, like, that is mostly due to societal prejudice driving people back. People who feel they can't pass, deciding that they're better off just and safer just not. Or in some cases, it's straight up just gender fluidity. I do know some people who have detransitioned just due to gender fluidity, and like it didn't delegitimize any of their previous experiences, and they still, just their expressions changed various ways over time. And people use both of those instances and act like those people weren't trans. And I've never met someone who detransitioned who wasn't actually trans in some respect.
oh, I know one person.
Yeah, I guess there are
One.
exceptions.
It's very rare. And even with the detransitioning, as you said, a lot of it is the societal pressure, it's abuse from family, it's neglect. It's this idea of, oh my god, I transitioned, I just got kicked out of my home, I can't find housing, I can't find employment, I'm out on the streets. What else can I do except detransition so I can just live? Because I can't get any of the access to society that I need to get to be able to live. And a lot of people end up falling down that trap and that hole where they step back and detransition. And you know what? Most of them are completely miserable because they weren't allowed to be able to live their lives because they didn't have a choice. They, in their minds, they didn't have a choice to keep fighting for it because they wanted to keep living and they wanted to be a part of the society. And let's face it, if you can't work and you don't have housing and you can't get a job, it's really hard to live in this world, especially in the United States. So what do you do? What do you do?
I was gonna say, and you have the religious phenomena similar to ex-gays of the ex-trans folks within those circles, and that ends up coming from just facing a lot of religious abuse. And it's funny because they twist religions which tend to actually historically be affirmative of more than just binary gender identities. Even if you look at just the root, we're a Christian nation in the US, quote unquote. Sorry,
Debatable.
Judeo-Christian nation. God, I hate that term. But you look at ancient Jewish society, and you look at the Talmud and the Midrash, both mention, I think, 7 different genders that they discuss.
It was either 6 or 8, but yeah.
They're trying to talk about, and they talk about it within the context of trying to sort out biblical law and how it applies to, and it's just to see that gender variation even in that, in the roots of that, and to see how far it's been colonized and bastardized into what it is today, in the same way that it was a religion started by people of color and then used by Europeans to colonize people of color. The Midrash makes the claim that Abraham and Sarah, the founders of all the major Abrahamic religions, are the basis of, like, we're both Tumtumen, I believe, which I'm not going to try to attempt to translate gender across culture. That's, but they were not, as best as we could translate, they were some sort of non-binary identity, possibly intersex, and which would really make the story of Sarah not being able to get pregnant have a whole different side to it, and make that miracle something that's, to see that be the basis of the Abrahamic religions, and to see the Abrahamic religions be driven so far off course to become a tool of hate against queer people in this country. It amazes me to no end how we're written out of history, and then when we're written out of history, they act like we're new, and then they, fucking use that as an excuse to crack down on us as some new threat. It's absolutely ridiculous. And we've seen it time and time again where we make advances in trans rights and it just gets squashed. Shit, if it wasn't for the Nazis, we would have actually been so much further in trans medical science, because one of the things that's really not talked about when they talk about the book burnings and all that is they burned a lot of medical literature on trans issues because they had one of the leading institutes focusing on trans medical sciences in Germany, and they destroyed all of that shit.
Yep.
And set us back decades in research in that area. Like, it's ridiculous. And then they try to claim that we weren't there.
Yeah. I want to go back real fast to talking about the instances or the contributing factor of poverty and homelessness and unemployment have on detransitioning, and talk about what I view as one of the most important policies that anarchists and libertarians can advocate for when it comes to queer rights, and that is universal basic income. If we had a UBI system in place, these threats on our life through poverty and homelessness and unemployment would not be the same issue, and it would allow queer people more freedom to live their lives if they didn't have to worry about society denying them these things necessary to live. And I just wanted to ask if you guys had other ideas of what policies or things that we could advocate for or fight against that would help queer liberation in the moment.
I think one thing that universal basic income doesn't, depending on how young you are when you get it, it doesn't. I think youth liberation is a big thing that we need to focus on, because trans issues seem to always crack down on and queer issues in general always seem to crack down on queer youth first and foremost. Yeah, so I think that we really have to focus on just youth liberation more generally and all that comes with that. And school truancy laws and compulsory schooling, like queer kids getting beat up in school and forced to go back. Like, no, like that shouldn't be a thing. Like, we need to really focus on school choice and offer them more alternatives and make sure that they are not forced to have into compulsory schooling, period. As far as expanding emancipation rights in certain areas and allowing small things, even to all folks, the right to have your own bank account not co-signed by your parent can be a huge thing. And I don't get why just because you're under 18 you have to have someone else signed on to your finances. That actually makes it hard for kids to learn independence and their own finances in some ways. And if they need to run away from home, their parents can cut them off from those bank accounts to strengthen their runaway rights and allow, so that way they're not immediately brought back home by the police. Different things like that.
Yeah, my parents were quite abusive when I was a teenager, and I filed for emancipation and lost. And I had thousands of dollars stolen from me by my father because he had access to my bank account. And I lost my vehicle because he had to sign it. And my independence as a young adult was hampered by almost a decade because I wasn't given these freedoms by the state. Like, I was told that because I was under 18, I was restricted in certain ways. And it made it hard to get away from an abusive family who was not accepting of me.
Yeah. It's unfortunate that that's the reality for a lot of youth. I mean, sports and medical treatment. Sports seems like such a tangential issue that, like, I wouldn't have even thought that was something on the radar that we'd be fighting for in the scope of things. But I guess that's the thing we have to also focus on now. But yeah, healthcare, like, we need to not just allow access to trans affirmative health care, but also we need to just expand access to health care, period. What's the use in having trans affirmative health care be legal if so many queer folks don't even have access to health care in the first place? And really removing the barriers that are in place there is a huge thing. And I know a lot of anarchists do, especially on the left, do advocate Medicare for all as like a transitionary measure, but that doesn't solve the problem even, because that doesn't solve the problem of the price, because they can still just charge whatever the hell they want to the government. And sure, the government can negotiate prices, but this is the same government being in bed with the corporations to begin with. You really expect them not to just line their pockets with our tax dollars? No. The whole thing, really, their power comes from patent law and things like that. That's even how the insurance industry maintains its power, is through patent law at the end of the day, because all these pharmaceutical companies are able to control prices of their drugs because they're not subject to competition. And then the insurance companies can negotiate with them to get a cheaper price on the drugs for their customers, and artificially inflate the price for everyone else. For insurance, once insurance became a thing, a lot of our medical care got inflated. A lot of our medical care costs got inflated because now insurance is covering half of that.
Well, insurance didn't always have the same structure that it does now. Like, the original idea of insurance was more of a mutual aid system.
Oh yeah, no, friendly societies and stuff were absolutely amazing and very much operated on libertarian grounds, and lodge practice is illegal.
Yeah.
In the United States.
Well, there are some Christian-based health shares. I would love to see libertarian health shares or anarchist health shares that are separated from a religious standing. Just for me personally, like, I would definitely pay more in health insurance prices if I knew that it was a health share with people who share my similar views. But unfortunately, it's only the Christian community in the U.S. who has dipped their toes into health shares at the moment. But Ashley, do you have any policies or ways that we could advocate?
I don't think any of this solves the problem. UBI, maybe it gives people little access to funding, but then inflation and taxes go up, and what do you really get to buy with it? A double cheeseburger from McDonald's? Great. So you ate for a day, but you really don't have access. None of this really solves the problem of access. None of this really solves the true problem of what's going on. The true problem is that we have people who are being voted in office who are completely ignoring medical professionals, historians, people who have done research, people who understand the queer community, and they are trying to legislate our lives. So the solution isn't any of those other things. The solution is taking their power away from them to control our lives. That has to be the solution. We have to say no. We have to say no, that these people do not get to get voted in the office and decide how we live or make our medical choices or make any choices, for that matter, in our lives over how we live. It's time to decriminalize choice. Decriminalize personal choices, so long as we're not hurting other people. That's what we need to fight for. We need to fight for a society that allows people to be who they are, to live their lives, without the interference of government, without the interference of people. Now, I get that that's a big ask.
Yeah.
And I get that that's going to take time and be incremental. But let's be real. Stop voting people into office who have no idea what the hell they're doing. That's number one. As long as the political system exists that everybody is the enemy, and I'm going to vote for my terrible person because they're just a little less terrible than the other person. That's how we ended up with Trump in office. That's how we ended up with Biden in office. That's how we ended up with Bush in office. Let's think about what we're doing. It's time to stop picking people who are evil. Like, we don't have to choose the lesser of two evils. We can choose no evil. We don't have to play in this system anymore. And the longer we play their games by their rules, the more they're going to win because the cards are stacked. The deck is stacked. They know the outcomes. They have all the resources. They already have the power. So we got to do something different. What that is, I think it's a combination of things. I think it's a combination of ideas. But what it starts with is it starts at home. It starts where you live now. It starts in your own community. Get involved. Take action. Build groups in your own community that fight against these things, that work against these things. Start gaining power in your own community, and you're going to have a much better life than you would otherwise. If a state has certain laws, we are seeing, think Tennessee, for example, they passed a law where any business who allows transgender people to use restrooms is required by law to have a sign in their window stating that they allow transgender people to use restrooms. You know what the Nashville DA said? I'm not enforcing it. Go fuck yourself. That's what they said.
Gendered restrooms in general are a creation of most zoning laws.
Yeah.
Like,
Exactly.
they're required by a lot of zoning laws, and if we just get rid of that zoning law, then businesses have the ability to choose not to have gendered restrooms.
That is a harm
Exactly.
reduction policy that you're advocating for. You're advocating to do harm reduction within the system by getting rid of that. So I just want to make sure that it's not entirely social. There are things we can do in the system, which
Yeah,
is getting rid
yeah,
of this
absolutely.
stuff. Okay.
Yeah.
But there's things that we can do, which is not enforce bad laws. And in order to do that,
You have to be in law enforcement, but
or
Yeah,
we have to be in office.
Or in a jury.
Or
yeah,
on a jury.
if your state
Exactly.
allows
Police
jury
and jurors
nullification.
can practice nullification, so we can encourage both to do so.
Some states
Exactly.
don't allow it.
I think
but
we'll have more luck getting jurors to side with nullification than police in most cases, but
Some states don't allow it, but you can still vote against prosecution. And
Oh, yeah.
in most states, as far as I know, the jury has to be completely 100% unanimous in order to prosecute. So you
Yeah,
can
there's a few
still hold the
states that
conviction and
don't.
vote no if you don't believe that it's right.
If anybody wants to learn anything more about jury nullification as a topic and how to use it as activism, you can check out Fully Informed Jury Association at fija.org. Just putting that out there. Love them.
Yeah.
IJA.org.
Yep.
Yeah, we're at a crossroads here in this country, in the United States, and we have three choices. We can sit back and let what's happening happen, and let the chips fall where they lie. We can give up, walk away, and let society be ran by people who, quite frankly, don't care if we live or exist. Or we can understand and recognize that all human beings have the right to live their lives, and we can come together and we can fight. And I don't know about anybody else, but I am going to go down fighting.
On a grassroots level, I think we need unionists like grassroots wildcat IWW, like Industrial Workers of the World style unionists, not corporate business unions but actual grassroots democratic unionism in the workplace. I've seen many workplaces that have fought for trans rights in various ways through their unions and gotten access to trans healthcare in some cases, but in most cases, just basic respect in the workplace and dealing with the transphobia and other bigotries in the workplace, both from the bosses and among employees sometimes, and also tenants unions. Housing is a real big issue in the queer community, as we said. Like, tenants unions on a grassroots level can be really good for helping with. We saw an uptick during this pandemic of people going on rent strike and forming tenants unions when they couldn't pay their bills because of these lockdowns. And we even saw during COVID, we even saw some businesses and landlords joining in on those strikes. But I think that tenants unions are very important. I think that gun rights, self-defense, very important. Yeah, armed queers don't get bashed.
I do want to jump in real quick and just say on the union thing, sometimes the unions go against that. I've seen workplaces where the unions are the ones that fought against trans inclusion.
It really depends on the unions.
Because their costs would go up for healthcare if they covered trans insurance, so they fought against it. Yeah, unfortunately, depending on where you live and the people who are part of that union and what their beliefs are, and the people who are in power, what they believe, that same power can be used to hold against people.
Oh, absolutely. And that's why when we're looking at the democratic grassroots labor movement in America, it's groups like the IWW, CIW, groups that have explicitly taken up these causes. And the unions that you're talking about are the business unions, the corporate unions that I'm very much called out in the beginning. So I very much agree with you. It depends on who makes it up. And you tend to have decisions that come down more on the side of finances rather than on the side of individual people. In corporate unions, it's the same thing where you have unions that operate in fields such as defense contracting. And like, my grandfather used to work for Lockheed Martin and was in a union. Like, their union leaned fairly conservative because if they went to war, they got more money because they made more weapons. And so there was like a very interesting kind of thing. So it really, whereas a lot of democratic grassroots labor unions tend to be based on human rights first and foremost rather than profit. And it really depends. It really depends on the union. You're completely right. It depends on the union, who's part of it, and all that. But yeah, and speaking of unions too, the union that I am part of, the IWW, which I mentioned earlier, we're also huge supporters of prison abolition, which is another huge queer issue. Prison and police abolition. We do a lot of work organizing prisoners specifically into our union, and they do a lot of work on the inside, pulling off labor strikes, things like that. And the way the queer community is disproportionately targeted by police and our legal system, and how career paths that many queer and trans people are forced into for various reasons, such as sex work and these professions that we have historically gone to as a community because we've been marginalized and because we haven't had as many resources. Queer communities get targeted. You see sex workers, drug users get targeted, and many of those folks can be disproportionately queer in some communities. Like, it's prison and police abolition are very huge issues. And I know when I was involved with Mikester and outright libertarians, one of the big things that we really tried to focus on was prison and police abolition and gun rights as our main issues at the time.
I think we've definitely filled up our time for the day. We had great discussions. I want to thank you both for coming on, and representing your philosophical sides. And are there any organizations that you want to do shout-outs for or self-promote? This is your time to give me all the stuff, and then I'll make sure to put it in the blurbs.
I know the Sylvia Rivera Law Project is always doing great work. The Audre Lorde Project does amazing work. Trans Lifeline is super important. If anybody is dealing with some shit, if you're worried about not having access to healthcare and all this, and that's sending you, or any of these other laws are affecting you, or anything's affecting you in a negative way that you need help and you're in a crisis, it's an amazing suicide crisis hotline that volunteer for or go seek support with. Yeah, Black and Pink. Go with some queer prisoners.
Be in their pen pal program. I need to start back up.
Armed Equality, Trigger Warning, Queer and Trans Gun Club. All those good ones.
Yeah. Wonderful. I'll make sure to link all of those. And Ashley?
Yeah, first, obviously, I'm going to say check out OutrightUSA.com. Come to our website. Check out what Outright Libertarians is up to, what we're doing. We are working on a lot of good policy. We are looking on a lot of outreach. And we have a big mission, and that is to stop legislatures from taking away our right to be who we are and live our lives. And what it comes down to is come to OutrightUSA.com, check out Out Libertarians. Get involved in your local communities. Get involved with local organizations who help the LGBTQ community. There are many organizations around the country that do amazing work. A lot of small organizations that you've never heard of. Some of the bigger ones, the Trevor Project, always a great organization. Take a look and be in contact with your ACLU, both locally and nationally. They keep a list of the legislation that's going on. They always have attorneys ready to help the queer community and people in the queer community with different issues. So they're a great, valuable resource. Trans Lifeline, of course, is so important. And it's such a different type of hotline than your average national suicide hotline. These are people that actually understand the queer community and especially the trans community and what they're going through. So you're talking to people who get it and people who have knowledge of the community, and that's so important when you're in crisis, that you're being heard by someone who understands what you're actually talking about. With that, it's Pride Month, and there are 3 things that you can do to help celebrate Pride. 1, join the fight. Pride is a resistance, Pride is a riot, and we have a lot of fighting to do. 2, instead of buying corporate Pride things, find LGBTQ candidates and donate to their campaigns. Help them get elected. Help them get into office so they can fight for our community and raise our awareness and stop these terrible laws. Because we've seen the people outside of the community that say they're our allies, they skirt around it a lot. And they're only our allies when they need our money or they need a specific vote. And I want to end this right here with that. I want to say, think about this. The Democrats at one point had control of the House, the Senate, and presidency from 2008 to 2010. And they made no attempts to fight for LGBTQ people or legalize gay marriage. It was the Supreme Court that did that.
Yep.
So don't think that they're automatically your friends. They tell you they'll fight for you, and then they'll do it only when they really need the extra votes. That's the tradition of that party. So don't trust them. Get in office yourself.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure anybody listening to this podcast is not going to be supporting the Dems.
Good. I just want to throw it out there. It's so important to remember that. It's so important to remember that a party that says, we are the party of the LGBTQ community. Go fuck yourselves, you are. You know how to use us. Dangle us all along on a string.
They only supported us when it was economically beneficial for them to support our community.
Yeah, when it came to the point of, if we don't support them, we can't win elections anymore because we've burnt bridges with everybody else, Then they started supporting us. So yeah, don't let people take advantage of you. But go out there and elect LGBTQ leaders in your community. Get out there, support them. Don't give your money to corporations who pretend to celebrate Pride with rainbows and glitter. Go out there and support the organizations that are doing work in your community, the nonprofits, the shelters who give aid to LGBTQ people, the food banks who give food to LGBTQ people, the nonprofit organizations out there fighting in their communities to have a place and have a home for the community. That's where your Pride money should go. That's where your money should go if you're going out there spending money to celebrate Pride. Give it to organizations who are fighting. Give it to candidates who are fighting. Get them in office. Help us get our voices heard. The only way we can fix this, the only way we can stop this terrible legislation is if we take seats and we're part of our voices heard at the table. And we do not have nearly enough voices at the table representative to or proportional to how many queer people there are in this country. So it's time to increase our proportions, and it's time to get elected, and it's time to fight. Get out there and fight. Don't just celebrate Pride. Don't just think it's a happy occasion. Yeah, it's great. But remember, as long as the government has the power to do so, they will try to take our rights away.
Yeah, great spot to end it on. Thank you both for coming on. And I'll make sure to have this episode uploaded, so next Monday. And I will tag you both and all the organizations that you guys supported. Thank you again.
And one last thing, go visit your Pride Center for any resources if you need it. There's usually one in your area or in the nearest big city to you.
Yes, good point.
Or call them up if you can't get to them.
Thanks again, y'all. Night.
Thank you.